Hi, my name is Tanya Woods, and I'm faculty here at Loyola School of Law, and I'm here to talk to you about a community called North Lawndale. Now, if you're in the professional identity formation class, then you're probably thinking to yourself, where in the heck is North Lawndale, and why is this community so important to my assignment? Well, you're in luck. I'm here to explain a couple of things about a community that I grew up from, not far away from. So let's just get a couple of the basic facts that you've probably by now done a little internet research just to make sure that we're all on the same page. How's that? So if you're like a lot of your classmates, you're not even from Chicago. And so you probably are just getting to know the names of the streets and the communities around the school, let alone communities that are nestled in the inner city. And North Lawndale is probably just as obscure as it was like any other community. But luckily, due to a couple of assignments that you've had by now, that you're getting your feet wet and you're like, oh, that's where that is. But why is this so important? But let's first talk about a couple of things just to make sure we're all on the same page. So first of all, the geography of Chicago. It's kind of like a crescent that hangs on the side of Lake Michigan, and yet it is still organized in a grid pattern. So it's pretty easy to follow a series of streets that are organized like horizontal and vertical lines to get you anywhere around the city, and many times in neighboring communities as well. And those communities were originally named by not only the original settlers and the folks who made their homes in those communities, but also primarily by the real estate industry. Real estate developers and folks who are in that industry are the ones who name those communities, ascribe attributes to those communities, and sometimes the boundaries may shift and change a little bit depending on, you guessed it, trying to make the property values go up and create a more desirable, trendy community so people will want to move in. North Lawndale has been North Lawndale for a very, very long time, so you're in luck. There's a lot of history there. Chicago is also largely divided by, and you'll hear this a lot, either the South Side or the North Side or the West Side. And among those of us who grew up here, there's an ongoing debate as to whether or not there's an actual East Side, which truthfully is as far south and as far east as you can get in the Chicago area. But that's a whole different conversation. Now, North Lawndale is a community on Chicago's west side. And like many communities on the west side, it was settled by European immigrants, and namely, in this instance, Eastern European immigrants. And it's situated just west of downtown. So if you were standing downtown and you look directly west, you could probably see the North Lawndale community, like if you were a bird or something of that nature. It's just west of the medical district. So you may know that medical research district around the University of Illinois at Chicago, Cook County Hospital, what used to be called Cook County Hospital, and many other research and medical related facilities in that area. Now, the people who lived on the west side, early in Chicago's history, so we're talking about late 1800s, the city was settled by a variety of European immigrants. And those immigrants often would settle in ethnic enclaves. Basically, you move in and around the people that you know. So it'd be no different than if one of us moved to a new city, and if you had cousins who lived there, you'd probably ask, hey, where do you live? And are there any new houses or apartments around where you live? They'd be like, sure, there's some houses down the street. No different here in Chicago. But before there were communities of Blacks or Latinx, these white communities, by and large, were European immigrants, and they would draw distinctions even among themselves. So you'd find that the Jews lived in one area, non-Jews in another, Eastern Europeans lived in a separate part from Anglo-Saxons, and then even within economic lines, factory workers didn't live in the same places, obviously, where aristocrats did. So these divisions, were a part of Chicago's early history. Now, enter the Great Migration, and Blacks fleeing the agrarian South came up north looking for better opportunities, a better life, better places to live, and quite honestly, work that they could feel good about. And often when they would come to the north, they were unfortunately surprised that there may not have been as many jobs as they were hoping for. And unfortunately, they weren't always able to live where they wanted to live. And so you find that folks were coming to places like Chicago or Detroit or Pittsburgh, New York, looking for jobs and looking for places where they could live near their jobs. And that wasn't always possible. Blacks were often relegated to the poorest communities that had the fewest resources. And those communities, yep, you guessed it, were on the west side and the south sides of Chicago. By the time you added into that discriminatory and racist housing practices that were sanctioned by our federal government, aided and abetted by our local government and municipal governments, unfair lending practices, redlining, blockbusting, and all sorts of other codified and sanctioned activities that sought to separate blacks from the whites, then you continue to see communities that were in dire need of resources but never received them. And so imagine this type of generation after generation after generation of having no investment in quality education, no investment in good hospitals or healthcare, no investment in infrastructure. So by the time the 1970s roll around, we see a lot of these industries that once were booming, they begin to dry up as industry then begins to change and morph. As jobs dry up, hopelessness and despair enters. Black people are still in a situation where they cannot move to any other communities. And so this is how you get the generational poverty, the generational joblessness, high unemployment, poor education. And these enclaves are now becoming not just a matter of choice, but these enclaves of poverty become places where you're only allowed to live. You can't really live anyplace else, and you can't really work anyplace else. So this becomes kind of the mainstay of the narrative of what the west side and the south sides of Chicago look like. Now I'm going to just share my personal story, hopefully to add a little light to this. I am, as I said before, from Chicago. I'm from the west side, from a community called Garfield Park. And Garfield Park is on the west side, and as the name implies, the communities around it, the homes around it, surround one of the major parks in Chicago called Garfield Park. And my community was all black, and it was by and large very, very poor. Our public school education was abhorrent, but at the time when I came up in the 70s, there was practically a Catholic school in every community. And why that's important is because a large part of the Catholic mission in large cities, in rural areas in the South, was to make sure that those people who could not have access to a high quality education could still get an education, even if it were through the church. That remains to be a large part of my personal jurisprudence and why I attended a school like Loyola, and why I continue to now have the benefit to work in the community that I actually grew up in. So my community was in a neighborhood called K-Town. And K-Town is so named because the streets in K-Town all start with the letter K. And so I grew up in an area near Costner and Monroe. And Monroe, named after, follows a number of streets like Monroe and Washington and Madison and Adams. The same streets you find downtown run all the way to the west side, back to that grid pattern. Now, I often say that I grew up poor. And some people may take exception with that because I was provided for. I had a home. My grandmother owned the home that my grandfather left behind, that they moved into in the 40s as part of that Great Migration pattern. And I did get an opportunity to go to Catholic schools and receive a great education throughout my entire life, which then afforded me the opportunity to go to a fantastic college, university, Northwestern, and then later on to Loyola School of Law. Now I get the privilege of serving my community at the Westside Justice Center as its chief operating officer of a free legal aid clinic. And that's great. It makes me feel wonderful to be able to do that and to give back in that way. But not so many people were so lucky. And the reason why I say I grew up poor is because we were always one paycheck away from not having things. And even though every adult in my household was working, we were among the working poor. So that meant that you didn't always get the latest anything. And that meant that you often had to do without sometimes. And it was a very austere and a very frugal lifestyle. And so I have much gratitude for my mom, who was a single mom, for my grandmother, who was widowed at a young age, at 40, and for all the other adults that made my life much more comfortable than it could have been for me growing up in that neighborhood, and as it was for a lot of kids that grew up on my block. And so I grew up in a community that was crime infested, that there was a great deal of violence, there was a lot of divestment in my community, meaning that as whites moved out, so did everything else. And so there might have been a local corner store here or there, similar to a bodega that you might find in New York City. But there were not high quality supermarkets, certainly nothing like a Whole Foods or a Mariano's or a Trader Joe's in my community. And that was very characteristic of many neighborhoods on the west side and south sides of Chicago. Now, were there enclaves where everybody was not working poor? Of course there were. There were small communities of blacks on the south side of Chicago, where there were more professional and maybe had a higher quality of living. But by and large, the south and west sides of Chicago, where black people and then later Latino people moved into, did not get the best. So hopefully that will give you a better picture of what North Lawndale looked like then, which is not all that dissimilar to what it looks like now. And the next time you see a news story or a current event or reading an assignment, you'll have a firsthand look at North Lawndale, one of what I believe to be one of the richest communities, tightly knit, kith and kin, families, many of which still live there, and folks like me who get the privilege of going back and working there. Thank you.